Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining today's discussion hosted by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies about the upcoming film Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Joshua Heschel story. I am Heather Miller Rubens, the Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar at ICJS. The mission of our organization is to dismantle religious bias and bigotry by building learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. That's why we're pleased to host programs like today's and are particularly excited to talk with two experts who are part of the ICJS learning community and who contributed to the Abraham Joshua Heschel documentary that will be aired on PBS in May for Jewish American Heritage Month. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Benjamin Sachs has been the Jewish scholar at ICJS for the past 7 years. Ben has published on topics related to Jewish philosophy, German Jewish history and culture, Jewish-Christian relations, and interreligious dialogue. His most recent project is a book entitled The Life of Quotation in Modern Jewish Thought, and it will be published early next year. Taylor Branch is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author known for his landmark narrative, History of the Civil Rights Era, America and the King Years. The trilogy required more than 24 years of intensive research and writing. Aside from writing, Taylor speaks before a variety of audiences. He's discussed doctrines of nonviolence with prisoners at San Quentin, as well as officers at the National War College. Branch has presented seminars on civil rights at Oxford University and in 6th grade classrooms. With all of this, we are also honored to count Taylor Branch as an ICJS Emeritus Trustee, a Baltimore neighbor, and a friend. So welcome to you both today. So beginning in May, PBS will be airing the new documentary filmed by Martin Doblmeier, Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Joshua Heschel story. For those of you who may not be familiar, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was one of the most remarkable and inspiring figures of the 20th century. He was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. and the entire civil rights movement. He was a leading critic of the Vietnam War. He was a champion for Soviet Jews and a pioneer in the work of interfaith dialogue. Born in Warsaw, Poland, Heschel was part of a dynastic royalty of Hasidic rabbis dating back centuries. He narrowly escaped the Holocaust and arrived in New York in 1940. Over the next 30 years, he emerged as one of the most influential voices in the world of religion. His many books, including The Prophets, The Sabbath, and God in Search of Man, are considered religious classics and are widely studied today. His picture hangs in countless synagogues across America, despite the fact that 50 years ago, most Americans, including Jewish Americans, vehemently disagreed with Heschel's public opinions. So that leads us to our first question for this afternoon. PBS is airing this film as part of Jewish American Heritage Month. Taylor, Ben, what does it mean to think of Heschel as a Jewish American thinker and leader?
Heschel was actually famous for saying that he's not a noun in search of an adjective when he was talking about his Jewish identity, that as a noun, he's a Jew, and he felt very comfortable with that as a noun, and that the many adjectives that make up that noun are interesting in terms of the many Jewish identities. And so in terms of an American Jewish identity, I think he would have seen himself as an American Jew, with the caveat of all of his suspicion about things like nationalism. But I think what makes him unique and uniquely American is that he brings, like you said in his biography, an Eastern European Hasidic experience to Western Europe, into the intellectual milieu of Berlin and philosophy. And he actually masters both of those traditions. He's a very gifted philosopher. He's also a very gifted Jewish thinker. And when he comes to the United States, his first position is at the Hebrew Union College, where he was training Reform rabbis in the Midwest in Cincinnati, before he ended up at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. And a lot of his work is trying to deal with issues that relate to the American Jewish experience explicitly. Take, for instance, The Sabbath, which is probably his most widely read book, where he's dealing with what he sees to be a spiritual void in the American Jewish experience, that we've become more committed to consumerism. And in fact, even economic systems like capitalism have really become our our religion or how we identify ourselves. And I'd put a footnote to that. If you think that's hyperbolic, just think about the beginning of the pandemic when the lieutenant governor of Texas stressed that we should all continue shopping, um, even if it meant sacrificing the lives of older people. Um, this was for a greater good, and that greater good was consumerism. I'd say that Heschel was keen and saw this as a potential problem. So in terms of his American Jewishness and why he's important is that he's always bringing traditional Eastern and Western European Jewish sources to deal with quintessentially American Jewish problems.
I think it's fair to see that King, like Heschel, was much more isolated within his own tradition than we want to believe then and now. Most people today think he was the quintessential Black preacher who represented everything Black preachers wanted to do. But in fact, he was very isolated among Black ministers, many of whom thought he was a troublemaker and didn't want to get anywhere near the kind of protest and jail going that he advocated. In fact, King, early in his career, tried to avoid the kind of sacrifice that the sit-ins and the freedom rides and the later movements in Birmingham later required. He tried to take over the National Baptist Convention, which was the organization, a giant organization of Black Baptist preachers, and was instead thrown out, literally kicked out as a threat to those people. After that, he spent 2 years trying to get President Kennedy to sign an executive order ending segregation like the Emancipation Proclamation, because we were coming up to the centennial 100-year anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But he couldn't get Kennedy to do it. And finally, at the time he met Heschel, King, had resolved to take the biggest gamble of his career and go into Birmingham, the bastion of segregation, and demonstrate there until he licked segregation or it licked him. That's when he met Heschel, and to me, it's significant theologically, but also historically, that King was about to embark on this great sacrifice that changed American history. At the same time, Heschel was literally trying to help the Catholic Church reform from its own anti-Jewish teachings for 2,000 years of hostility to Jews. There are not very many people, I know I quoted Heschel in one book, sending a memo to the church saying, we understand that the church holds all of humanity guilty for the death of Jesus, not just Jews. It takes a pretty bold person to be telling Christians what they really believe when you're a Jewish rabbi, and I think that gives a grain of the unity that brought them together. They both discovered they were fringe figures with a tremendous belief that the heart of their faith was being ignored and required prophetic witness. So they could almost give the same speeches oftentimes from the moment they first met in January 1963.
I want to pick up on the phrase you just used, Taylor, which I think is an important one, of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Heschel being fringe thinkers. And thinking about what does it mean to be on the fringes of sort of American society, and what does it mean to be sort of prophetically calling out towards the center of American society. And I know that Rabbi Heschel is so well known for writing his book, The Prophets, in 1962. For those of you who don't know, this book was based upon his dissertation work, which he did in Germany in the 1930s. Civil rights leaders Andrew Young, as well as Martin Luther King Jr., both had heavily marked up copies of Heschel's book, The Prophets, in their libraries. And I would love for you to talk more with our audience today about why Heschel's book, The Prophets, is so important to the civil rights movement and to civil rights thinkers.
Andy Young and C.T. Vivian, James Lawson, any number of people that were prominent in the civil rights movement told me that they carried certainly the first volume of the prophets, which is what I have here. They didn't just have it in their library; they had it in their suitcase.
Mm.
They took it around because they had never seen a theologian write with the pithy moral force of of Heschel. I said he was like Hemingway. He wrote in very short sentences, but they packed enormous force. And to get, I mean, just talking about injustice. Moralists of all ages have been eloquent in singing the praises of virtue. The distinction of the prophets was in their remorseless unveiling of injustice and oppression, in their comprehension of social, political, and religious evils. They didn't just want to sit around and talk about how wonderful virtue was or how God was. They were outraged by the way widows and orphans were treated. And later in the same book, he says the prophets were the first figures in history to hold kings accountable for the way they treated widows and orphans. And that the prophet Hosea was the first figure ever to say that the use of force by the state was evil and not the epitome of order. So these were things that really resonated with King, and that comes out in Heschel's view of how prophets really brought religion alive. He says in there are no proofs for the God of Abraham. They're only witnesses. And most of us are not very good witnesses.
In an essay that he wrote called Dissent, I wanted to read a quote of his before I talk about it, just to get a sense of where he's coming from. He writes that Judaism, and this is the quote, Judaism in its very essence came into being as an act of dissent, a dissent from paganism, as an act of nonconformity with the surrounding culture. And unless we continue to dissent, unless we continue to say no to idol worship in the name of a higher yes, we will revert to paganism. And so paganism and idolatry is obviously a very broad category. And the way to really understand the power of the prophets is that the reason why the prophets can speak to people so deeply is that the prophetic impulse is actually in each and every one of us. And that's what makes the prophets so powerful and also annoying. So an example I want to give is that I live in Baltimore City, and I often see people who are homeless and asking for help. And a lot of us will look away. And that's not to say that you're not interested in helping the person, that you're not interested in fighting injustice. We as a society have created enough tools to focus on the individual to a point where we become indifferent to suffering. I have to get home. I have to cook dinner. I have to help my kids with their schoolwork. I don't have time for this individual. Yet there's something in that moment. And this is what Heschel will, when we could talk about this later, call the Divine Pathos, that nudges me and says, I need to look at this person, because this person represents not just her or his own suffering, but the suffering of everyone all around us. And what the prophet does is attuned to that suffering, and is attuned to that suffering in a way that actually represents God's commitment to that suffering. Because for Heschel, God is an emotive being, and this was a dangerous theological position. God is not some abstraction like the unmoved mover. God is someone, or not something or someone, but some presence that is moved by the suffering and joy of all people. And the reason why that it's the case is that God chose to make God self-dependent on human beings in order to create the world. And so in creating the world, human beings participate in acts of justice. And so what I want to say in terms of its relationship to Jewish tradition, Heschel is drawing upon a very opaque Kabbalistic idea called ha'avodat tzorech gevua, which literally means service in need of a high. But Arthur Green, who's the president of Hebrew College, offered a really lovely translation that it's devotion to fulfill a divine need. And for Heschel, that word avodah is essential. It means work, it means service, it means devotion, worship, prayer. And so just like when you go to synagogue and avodah, prayer is a form of work, the work of justice is actually a form of prayer. Both are essential into bringing divinity into the world. The prophets are the ones that do that because the rest of us choose to look away. And that's what puts them on the margins. And that's why Heschel says we need to dissent, because all the things that we've been acculturated to do is to focus on ourselves and not the suffering of others.
Thank you for that, Ben. I kind of want to build off of that and bring it back to you, Taylor, about, could you reflect a little bit about the role of dissent in the US context, in US tradition, and the sort of important role that a tradition of dissent played in the civil rights movement?
Well, of course, the civil rights movement was dissent in its highest form, and it finally, you know, it started on the very fringes in the sit-ins. People thought they were panty raids when they first started. They couldn't take Black students seriously sitting in at lunch counters. What does that have to do? But with anything, but within 5 years in Selma, you literally had the whole country coming together over what the meaning of witness was, and the spiritual but also patriotic discipline of people who were willing to march in Selma. If you see America as an experiment in self-governing public trust, there's no one more self-governing and more trustful of the public than someone who's willing to submit nonviolently to getting beaten up, like a freedom rider. In that sense, it is very, very patriotic. And Heschel recognized that, and that the prophets themselves were very, very isolated in their own time in ancient Israel, and were put into the Jewish canon, even though they often said that God was acting through their enemies to punish Israel for unrighteousness. These are dissenting characters by their very nature, but they're dissenting toward the true faith of equal souls and equal votes. And I think that's one of where King and Heschel, King said he learned from Heschel that the spiritual antecedents of democracy, equal votes, that we all believe, which is preposterous to most people, that everybody should have a vote that counts equally, that the antecedent for that was the prophet saying that justice is recognizing equal souls for the widows and orphans and holding kings accountable for the way they treated them. And so they came together with this tremendous communion about the responsibility of citizens. You know, when Bloody Sunday occurred, everybody knows the films of Bloody Sunday and John Lewis being beaten on Edmund Pettus Bridge. King sent out a telegram that night, and the very first words of the telegram are virtually a quote from Heschel. He said, "No American is without responsibility for the events that took place there." Basically saying some are guilty, but we're all responsible. And he invited clergy of all faiths to come and march from the very spot where people were beaten. And by that time, the dissent had reached so deeply into American culture that within 48 hours, there were 2,000 clergy people in Selma willing to march on the very place where people had just been beaten. That was a truly remarkable time about the maturity of a movement that started off in dissent, but literally came to a place where you could feel history being made. That's where the Voting Rights Act was made. And of course, Heschel came down there to march later with Dr. King in Selma. Those are very famous pictures of them marching together with Hawaiian leis around their neck, because clergy came from as far away as Hawaii to be there in Selma.
I love that you brought up that sort of iconic image, because I think we all are familiar with that of Heschel and ML King, as well as other leaders walking on the bridge together. What struck me most about last part of what you just said, Taylor, was thinking about the widow and the orphan. And then I was thinking about Heschel as an immigrant, as a refugee, as someone who also lost close family members in the Holocaust. And maybe Ben, I'll bring this back to you. Can you talk about how Heschel maybe understood himself in those terms, as a refugee, as an immigrant, and as someone who was directly affected and impacted and harmed by the evils of the Holocaust?
When Heschel gave talks at synagogues and churches and community centers, this question often came up about the Holocaust, and it wasn't something that he wrote a lot about. But his answers usually had to do with, like a good rabbi, theological musings on the nature of a human being. And so what he'd like to do is to say, he would joke with his audience and say, what commandment did God break? And after some time, people are trying to figure out what commandment could God have broken, and it was God created human beings in God's image, which meant that we had the potential to make ourselves idols, and making our culture idols, and making our society idols. In so doing, we other people in such a way as to utterly dehumanize them and strip that divine image. In having freedom of will, in this covenantal relationship, there is that danger of idolatry. The Holocaust for Heschel was when the foundations of society had become so hardened and so indifferent that that something like this could take place, to the point where when people would ask Heschel, where was God during the Holocaust? His rejoinder was simply, where were you? You have the temerity to talk about some divine intervention, but we actually had the tools to prevent this. We have the tools to make a better society. It's part of our covenantal relationship with God in order to build a better society. When he came to the United States, he saw that potential, one that he did not see in Europe, one that he left. But what deeply troubled him was this pathological obsession with racial prejudice in the American cultural milieu. And that was creating the conditions again for an idolatry that would set the stage for some of the worst violence. But in the American context, he saw potential precisely because, and this is a major difference in American Christianity than in European Christianity, he saw in the African American church this deep connection to the Old Testament, what Christians called the Old Testament. And, an Old Testament, when Jews, we hear that term, we sort of shudder. We know that it's old, but it didn't need to be replaced. We're content with Torah. And there's this idea of supersessionism that took place in Europe that led to that kind of dehumanization. The African American church actually took the narrative of the Old Testament as a way of liberating themselves by bringing Christianity to its roots. For Heschel, that was mind-blowing, that an oppressed people, oppressed by the same religious tradition that he was oppressed by, could use that tradition and use what he saw as the quintessential Jewish voice to liberate themselves, meant that there was something that he could do with this community to make the United States a better place. And as an immigrant, he understood immediately, and this is well before this kind of language, the issues associated with whiteness and white privilege and structural racism. He understood, walking on the Upper West Side, when an African American was angry at him for being white, he didn't interpret that as the same type of anti-Semitism he felt in Europe. He wanted to understand what the conditions were that made his very presence an anathema to a persecuted minority. And so his role as an immigrant was to lay the foundations for justice, again, to do that work of avodah, which I talked about maybe 10 minutes ago, the work of partnering with God. And so his experience as an immigrant was inexorably linked to the experience of the African American church, and I think that was quite powerful for him.
We keep touching on Heschel's view of God. So we're an interreligious institute. I think it's time that we talk some theology here. So Heschel wrote several important theological works exploring both the nature of God, right, God's self, and God's relationship to humanity. I'm thinking specifically of Man is Not Alone from 1951, and then God in Search of Man from 1955. So could you talk a little bit more about Heschel's view of God, and then maybe help build the bridge that we're kind of gesturing towards about how Heschel's view of God made sense of some problems in the United States and put challenges to some problems in the United States?
I read on the radio yesterday something that Heschel said that I think goes a lot to his view of God as something that if it's not felt and it's not present, that it's more a matter of witnessing and being in communion with than this abstract belief. And that he said this when he and King met in January '63. In the context of that, it was a conference on religion and race in Chicago, 9 years after the Brown decision, when America was still as segregated virtually as it had been in 1954. And the question was, can the church do anything about it? And the overwhelming mood of the conference was no. Most people said the church had waited too long, that it was too removed from the world, that churches themselves were segregated, synagogues were aloof by and large, and that it was over. And one person literally said, the best thing we can do is weep. The church has no role here. And it really offended Heschel. He actually rebuked people and said, that wasn't right. But his opening speech said, religion and race, how can the two be uttered together in this conference? To act in the spirit of religion is to unite what lies apart, to remember that humanity as a whole is God's beloved child. To act in the spirit of race is to sunder, to slash, to dismember the flesh of living humanity. Perhaps this conference should have been called Religion or Race. You cannot worship God and at the same time look at a man as if he were a horse. And he goes on to quote Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And King had already written that same quote into his speech, which ended, let there be a grain of profit in everyone. Meaning that these abstract beliefs don't mean anything unless we have something of the prophet that is willing to commune with God in realizing this form of justice.
I just want to have a caveat before I start talking about Heschel's view of God, is that in the titles that you mentioned, God in Search of Man, Man in Search of God, we see a lot in Heschel's writing the word man, and man is coterminous with human being. His daughter, Susanna Heschel, is one of the most important Jewish feminist voices in the US today. And also a very important reader of her father's works. But in the sense of feminism, it really is important, also in the spirit of the Bible. You know, in the book of Proverbs, death and life are in the power of the tongue. The words that we use actually matter. So if man is coterminous with human, then what is woman? So I'll probably use some of Heschel's language, but I want us to be cognizant of the problems in using a gendered word to describe all of humanity. The amazing thing about English is that we have thousands upon thousands of words. We can use other words to describe being human. We don't need the word man. Now to God. Also a word that, or a topic that Jews usually don't talk about with a great deal of gusto because of this fear of idolatry. So God for Heschel, think about God as presence, like Taylor was saying, in that God is not a thing. And when we think about our day-to-day lives, we always think about ourselves as a subject in relationship to all sorts of objects. Most of the sentences we use, we use the word I. We speak in the first person. Um, that's obvious, but it also can become a problem because we could also be an object for this greater presence, God. But God can never be an object to us because, right, we've created an idol. So how does he develop a view of God without slipping into idolatry? So for those of you who have taken our classes at ICJS, you know that we often quote Exodus 3:14, Ihiyeh asher ihiyeh. I will be that I will be, I am that I am. It's what God says God's being is when Moses says to God, who shall I sent me? And so God says, Ihiyeh asher ihiyeh. Now this is very important to Heschel, as it is for a lot of Jewish thinkers, because the grammatical form that God uses is a very obnoxious one. And why is it obnoxious? Because it's not committing to any future or present tense. What do I mean when I say that? This morning, I needed to get my son out of the house and to school. His carpool ride was going to be here at a certain time. I needed him to get off his phone. I needed him to come downstairs and do his thing. And I said, hey, come downstairs, breakfast is ready. And you know what he said? What do you think he said? He said, I'm coming. Right? So he never committed to the act itself. He extended the present for however long he wanted it to be. He's using a grammatical tense to continue doing what he's doing without actually committing to any particular act. That's the grammatical form that God used when God said, I am that I am. Meaning that it's an incomplete act in time. And so for Heschel, God is this presence in time, and that we experience at various moments in time. And he builds off a philosophy from a philosopher named Martin Buber, the idea of I and thou. And that for Buber, you have these relationships with people, art, whenever, even animals, where time sits still. Right? You lose track of time. You're in a moment, and no two moments are ever the same. And you can't ever bring yourself back to that moment. Sometimes divinity comes in, and when divinity comes in, you're transformed by it. You're commanded by it. And so for Heschel, that's the power of God, is that God commands us. Every single time, like I had said with the person who was homeless, that you see that person and you look away, you're avoiding the commandment. You're avoiding God's presence. It doesn't make you a bad person per se, but if you do it enough times and it becomes habit, then you've taken God's presence out of the world and replaced it with our own. And when people are in control, we know what happened.
Well, thank you both for just a wonderful conversation. I want to turn now to questions from the audience regarding the religion and race speech from 1963, Taylor, that you mentioned. Someone from the audience wants to know, how do we respond to people who say that religion doesn't unite, but rather sunders us too? I think they're playing off of the quote you read, which is a lovely one.
Well, it's kind of like, where was God in the Holocaust? Where were you in the Holocaust? Your religion may unite, but our job is to may divide, but our job is to use religion to unite. I mean, it seems to me that that's the underlying deepest message within religion. That's why King and Heschel and many other people are ecumenical at heart, because it's a bromide to say that all religions tell people to be nice and not to kill and not to hate, and are created by the same God, and yet in two sentences later they're in some doctrinal assertion of superiority over other faiths. That's what you're really fighting against, is perversions of religion that are allowed to use religion to divide people.
Thank you for that. Another question from the audience. that focuses on dehumanizing, which is building off of what you just mentioned. So picking up on that idea of dehumanizing, how might Heschel react to the way COVID is affecting death and dying this year, especially in long-term healthcare settings? There's a very specific long-term healthcare settings and COVID question, but I think it is a good linkage with the dehumanizing impulse that Heschel was pushing back against.
Well, I think it's a perfect question for religious figures to address, because what is COVID but about managing the risk of dying, which is ever present, against your relationship with other people, and trying to protect them and yourselves together in some sort of balance, but between risk and an awareness of mortality. To me, I think that it's remarkable that you haven't heard many more religious voices talking about how to manage COVID and what the religious imperatives should be. I mean, we pay endless attention to the medical authorities, maybe not as much as we should. Some people ignore them. But these are spiritual issues too, because we're talking about everyone's shared mortality and how to manage it in everyday life. And at one extreme, you could never come out of your house, whether COVID is here or not. And at the other extreme, you could be reckless with regards to everyone else's safety. It substitutes for the larger issue that religious voices are not more present in American life the way they were in Heschel's time and King's time. And what I'm trying to say is that it took tremendous struggle for the voices to become as prominent as they were. After all, that conference was in January of '63, when they were saying religion has not said anything about the Brown decision and not really spoken to the racial crisis in America. And it's only 2 years later that all those people are flocking to Selma. And those are clergy people, those are rabbis, those are nuns, defied the church. Episcopalians went down there against the edict of the Bishop of Alabama. So in only 2 years, church voices went from being relatively inert to being right at the center of history in Selma. And we need something like that today, because all you ever hear about religion is the religious right.
Yeah, so to build off of that, there's another question from the audience that's it seems like a natural segue. So it's looking around at the world today. Do we have prophets? Do we have religious leaders with the potential impact of Heschel or M.L. King today? If not, why not?
Can I just also add to the final point that Taylor made in terms of the dehumanization and long-term care with COVID? Because I think that for Heschel, that dehumanization takes place in how we talk about people in society and how we value them. So when we talk about people who are productive, that somehow puts people in a different sphere. And for Heschel, once we start creating hierarchies of human beings, then we start to decide who's valuable and who's expendable. And the idea that the people who are older in long-term care become more expendable or deserve less attention or deserve less integrity, while a lot of people who say who aren't saying that may be implying that for Heschel, that's also a form of idolatry and is getting in the way of divinity from entering the world. A human being has a birthday and a death day, and everything that happens in between requires the dignity that you would give to God. Are there prophets today? So the question that I would ask of all of us, what are the issues that make us most uncomfortable with? Like, we have values, we have politics, we have people who speak to those politics, and we rally around those people. But are there certain individuals within our own community, within our own politics, that make us uncomfortable, who speak truths that we're not ready to get behind, that we can hear those people, but we don't feel them? Or it's requiring too much sacrifice of ourselves in order to get behind a political position. We know that those individuals are there because we tune them out. And so the prophets are there. And they're the ones that are sacrificing the integrity of their own power to get the message across that being created in the image of God is something true for all people, even at the expense of our own comfort. For the prophets, an injustice somewhere is an injustice everywhere. So the prophets are the ones that literally don't enjoy time because they suffer with everyone else. I'm not suggesting this one person is a prophet, but the author Primo Levi, who is a Holocaust survivor, once talked about a moment in the concentration camp where the sun peeked out of the sky and hit him on the face. And for a moment, he felt warmth. And then just a second later, he realized that he was hungry. The prophets don't find comfort in anything. They will not rest until the conditions for justice are laid everywhere in the world. So they're out there. If you want me to name them, that's more of an indication of who I see as doing prophetic work rather than prophets more generally. But there are prophets today, for sure.
So here's some questions around the role of prophecy, dissent, and how that works in kind of internal community. So the question goes as follows. So some Jews in the South, even though they were in favor of desegregation, expressed frustration with Northern Jews' participation in the civil rights movement because they worried the backlash in the South would fall upon their communities after the Northern Jews had left and gone home. Can you talk some about how Heschel did or would have thought about this conundrum?
That was a perpetual issue everywhere, like a generic issue that King had to deal with. He wrote about it a lot in the letter from Birmingham jail. People rarely said, Martin Luther King, you are wrong and segregation is right for these reasons. Most people said, you may have a point, but you're going about it in the wrong way, and you shouldn't use children, you shouldn't break the law, and you shouldn't do. So people were ingenious at finding ways to sidestep the moral issue that was there. And to forget, in the case of Southern Jews, that one of the people that he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail to was a rabbi who signed on to the letter rebuking him for protesting segregation in Birmingham. So I think King would understand this, and Heschel would understand the fact that Jews felt isolated there. But King had the same problem. Most preachers did not want him to bring his demonstrations to their city. When he went to Selma, the requirement to go to Selma was to find at least one church that would allow him to have meetings there. Most churches wouldn't allow meetings about voting because they knew that it would bring on persecution. A church needs to have its lights on. It needs to have its taxes paid. It needs to be up to code. Churches are vulnerable. He couldn't find a church in Chicago. So I think it's kind of part of a larger problem that when there is a witness that's in keeping with the faith, that people will find ways to duck from that in some ways that's not a direct moral challenge, but an indirect one. And so, I grew up in Atlanta, where the Jewish community was pretty prominent. We had a Jewish mayor before we had a black mayor in Atlanta, and they were not, by and large, leaders in the civil rights field, but then they became prominent later. So, I just think this is a perpetual issue that people speak to their own exposure more than they speak to the underlying principles.
To build on this, another question from the audience, and then I think we'll have time for maybe one more before starting to wrap up. This is directed at you, Taylor. Could you speak about Heschel's leadership against the war in Vietnam to kind of keep your thoughts going? And what does it mean to lead clergy and laity and religious people against the war in Vietnam? One
of the things that was important right from the beginning was that King and Heschel believed that it was important to have a religious-led, a clergy and laity, that is religious lay people, to have an explicitly religious organization speaking about something as secular, where religion's voices were normally to the side. You know, Norman Thomas famously said that the Christian church was against every war except the one we're in. And King and Heschel, and they recruited Protestants, the Barragans, Protestant theologians, and formed this organization. And it was really hard to get it going. It was a truly marginal. If you could find one clergyman in a city that was willing to speak out and sign leaflets and put ads in the papers and hold meetings for clergy and laity in concern, you were doing good. And Heschel was that Jewish leader. He was that voice that Jews could not dismiss any more than Christians and Black people could dismiss King, even though at the beginning, the Vietnam War, let's face it, was profoundly popular for an awful long time in public opinion. And but it did grow. They held marches. They marched into Arlington Cemetery in February of '68, just a couple of months before King was killed. Heschel asked King to come up and speak to, actually many times, at rabbinical conferences up in the Catskills, and he was speaking at one, just the week before he was killed, and it was about the prophetic reason that even after the 6-day war in Israel, how Jews that supported the 6-day war in Israel there, should still be against the war in Vietnam. Those were hard issues, but they were very fundamental.
So one more question from the audience. Can you speak to Heschel's understanding or his vision or his belief in an afterlife?
There is a concept of afterlife in Jewish tradition. It's very abstract. It shows up in the Talmud and Kabbalistic sources, but most Jews don't write about the afterlife or what's called the world to come. Heschel absolutely believed in a God who connected to him as a human being with a first and last name, as someone individual who may share in some eternity. But my guess is, because Heschel doesn't write about afterlife, my guess is that he probably would have been interested with the view that my rabbi told me about the afterlife, which I have family here, so they probably remember this too. We're all going to the same place in the end, and it's not just the ground. It's a yeshiva. It's a study hall where we study Torah for eternity. For some people that's heaven, and for others that's hell. So in doing good work in the world, you want to make sure that Torah is enjoyable, because that's your fate. But Heschel doesn't talk about the afterlife in terms of his theology, and that's not uncommon for Jewish thinkers. It
is more of a Christian preoccupation, perhaps.
Much more. Much more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why I always talk about my rabbi's comment, because it wasn't something that we thought about all that much.
I'll never forget Rabbi Mark Loeb, blessed be his memory, who was a student of Heschel's, saying that a lot of Jews didn't want to talk about God, let alone the afterlife, and that Heschel got to be controversial at the Jewish Theological Seminary because he said, all you want to teach is how to administer a synagogue. You don't care about anything about God and God's pathos and our place in the world. So for him, I think he used up all of his religious assertion, getting people to try to deal with justice and God, and he never got around to the afterlife, as far as I can see.
As a final wrap up, Taylor, Ben, we want to encourage everyone to watch this documentary, to watch this PBS movie. What's a big question you would want to suggest to our audience to bring with them into the movie?
Where are these voices? I know Ben said there are prophets here, and I'm sure that's true, but they haven't made the sacrifices and the effort to achieve the public platform that didn't come naturally for either King or Heschel. And it took a lot of effort. And, you know, I just hope more people can do it. My other thing is, if you're at all interested in Heschel beyond watching the film, you will not regret reading the prophets. It is truly a remarkable work.
I want to second reading the prophets, especially the first book. A lot of people go and read the Sabbath as their first book, which is fine too, but the prophets is needed now. Going into this film, I would try to ask yourself what it is that you think needs to be changed or bettered in society, and what is it that you're actually doing to make that change. Heschel asks that of us, and he really demands a certain sacrifice. And thinking about what those issues are and how we want to transform society, going into the film with those questions, I have a feeling that Heschel's life and thought will move you in a direction that you may or may not expect, but to actually do avodah, to do that work, because it never ends, and there's always something more to do. So use this movie as a way to inspire you to put yourself even more out in the world.
One might say then the title for the film, Spiritual Audacity, is an important one. That to be audacious, what does it call, what does it demand of us to be audacious in this moment? That might be a good thing to bring to the film. Well, thank you both, Taylor Branch, Ben Sachs, for a wonderful conversation, a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Be well, stay safe.